On July 20, 2017, the world lost a voice that had already saved millions. Chester Bennington, the frontman of Linkin Park, a band that sold over 100 million albums worldwide, was found dead at the age of 41 in a quiet bedroom. For over 17 years, his songs became an emotional lifeline for an entire generation. If his music saved so many lives, why couldn't it save his own? What made Chester Bennington different was never his fame, it was his honesty. Long before the world talked openly about mental health, he was already screaming about it, night after night, on stages filled with tens of thousands of people. Songs like Crawling, Numb, and Breaking the Habit weren't metaphors. They were confessions pulled straight from his life, addiction, self-hatred, and memories he could never escape. Few people knew that Chester had been sexually abused as a child, between the ages of 7 and 13. He carried that trauma into adulthood, into marriage, into fatherhood, and into every microphone he ever stood behind. Alcohol and drugs didn't create his pain, they were how he tried to silence it. Even after years of sobriety, the thoughts never fully left. In 2017, just 2 months before his death, Chester lost his closest friend, Chris Cornell. He sang at Cornell's funeral, barely holding himself together, later writing that grief felt like a hole that never stops growing. To the outside world, Linkin Park was still selling out arenas. To Chester, the noise had never been loud enough to drown out what lived inside his head. And that contradiction, saving others while slowly losing himself, is where this story truly begins. Chester Bennington was born in 1976 in Phoenix, Arizona. From the outside, his early life appeared unremarkable, no public turmoil, no dramatic events that suggested what would come later. But some childhoods don't break in visible ways. They fracture quietly, through experiences that are confusing, isolating, and never fully explained. Between the ages of 7 and 13, Chester went through repeated experiences that crossed personal boundaries with someone he trusted. At that age, a child does not have the language, power, or understanding to process what is happening. What forms instead is confusion and fear, followed by a lasting sense that something essential has been taken away. More damaging than the events themselves was the lesson learned afterward, that pain is something you are expected to carry alone. Chester never spoke about it at the time. Not because it didn't matter, but because shame arrived early. Long before he could understand what had happened, he internalized a quiet conclusion, that something about him was wrong, that being hurt meant being flawed. That belief didn't disappear as he grew older. It settled into his identity, shaping how he saw himself and how much kindness he believed he deserved. At the same time, his family life was becoming unstable. His parents separated when he was young, and Chester moved between households without ever feeling fully rooted. Stability, the one thing a vulnerable child needs most, vanished early. For someone already struggling with a shaken sense of safety, this instability reinforced a powerful message: there was no place where he could fully relax, no environment that would reliably protect him. Very early on, Chester learned to survive by staying quiet. At school, he felt different from other kids. Older somehow. Heavier. While his peers moved through the world with ease, Chester moved cautiously. He observed more than he participated. Trust didn't come naturally. Comfort felt temporary. Even in ordinary moments, he remained alert, as if expecting something to go wrong. The pain had nowhere to go, so it turned inward. As he entered adolescence, that buried weight began to surface as constant tension, sudden anger, and a deep sense of self-criticism. Chester didn't know he was dealing with unresolved trauma. He only knew that his mind rarely slowed down, that rest felt unreachable. Silence became uncomfortable, because his thoughts filled it too quickly. Alcohol and drugs entered his life not as rebellion, but as escape. They didn't bring joy. They brought numbness. For the first time, his thoughts softened. Memories faded into the background. The pressure inside him loosened. That temporary relief felt like control, and for someone who had grown up feeling powerless, that feeling was difficult to give up. Music arrived for the same reason. Chester didn't approach music as a dream of success. He approached it as a necessity. Singing allowed him to release emotions without having to explain them. He didn't need the right words. His voice carried what language couldn't. Anger, sadness, confusion, all of it could exist together in sound. But music didn't heal him. It gave his pain somewhere to live. By the time Chester reached adulthood, the psychological foundation was already set, early boundary violations left unaddressed, habits built around avoidance, and an identity shaped by endurance rather than peace. He wanted connection, but closeness felt risky. He wanted to be understood, but doubted that full acceptance was possible. Mental health support was not widely discussed at the time, especially for men, and especially for people carrying quiet, complicated histories. Silence was often mistaken for strength. Pushing through was praised as maturity. Chester absorbed those ideas completely. He didn't lack effort. He lacked tools. He lacked protection. He lacked a space where healing was allowed to happen without judgment. And from this foundation, a childhood shaped by confusion and silence, years of internalized blame, and a voice strong enough to carry what he could not say, Chester Bennington emerged. Not as a tragedy in waiting, but as someone who had learned how to function while hurting long before anyone was listening. Everything that followed, the music, the connection with millions, the pressure, and the eventual collapse, did not appear suddenly. It began here. By the late 1990s, Chester Bennington wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing stability, emotional, financial, psychological, anything that could keep his life from collapsing under its own weight. He had already been through rehab once. He was newly married, becoming a father, and desperately trying to convince himself that adulthood would finally quiet what childhood had broken. Music, at that point, was not a career. It was a necessity. Chester joined a local band called Grey Days, where for the first time, people noticed something different in his voice. It wasn't technical perfection. It wasn't style. It was raw emotional exposure. When Chester sang, it sounded like someone with nothing left to hide, because he didn't. The band gained a small following, but success remained distant. Money was tight. Tension grew. Eventually, Grey Days fell apart. What followed was one of the most fragile periods of Chester's life. He was working low-paying jobs, struggling to support his family, and fighting the constant pull of addiction. Sobriety didn't feel empowering. It felt exhausting. Every day was restraint. Every night was temptation. The trauma was still there, untreated, waiting for weakness. Then came a phone call that would quietly change everything. A group of musicians from California were searching for a new vocalist. They had demos. They had structure. What they didn't have was a voice that could carry emotional truth. Chester recorded his audition vocals late at night, in a small apartment, while his family slept. There was no producer. No audience. Just a microphone and years of unprocessed pain. When the tapes reached the band, then called Zero, the reaction was immediate. This wasn't just a singer. This was someone who sounded like he had lived inside the lyrics. They asked him to join. Chester packed up his life and moved to Los Angeles, leaving behind everything familiar, betting everything on one uncertain future. The band soon renamed itself Linkin Park. What made the early days different wasn't ambition, it was alignment. Chester didn't have to pretend. Mike Shinoda's introspective writing met Chester's emotional intensity in a way that felt almost surgical. The music wasn't about rebellion or image. It was about internal collapse. Anxiety. Rage. Shame. Disconnection. When Chester screamed, it wasn't performance. It was memory. Still, the path wasn't smooth. Record labels rejected them repeatedly. Some said the sound was too aggressive. Others said it was too emotional. Chester, already sensitive to rejection, absorbed every no as confirmation of his deepest fear, that something inside him was fundamentally wrong. But for the first time, he wasn't alone in that feeling. The band kept refining their sound, drawing directly from personal struggles rather than trends. Chester wrote lyrics during moments of emotional overload, often pulling from journals filled with thoughts he never intended anyone to read. The more honest the music became, the stronger it felt. In 2000, Hybrid Theory was released. What followed wasn't gradual success. It was an explosion. Within a year, the album sold millions. Songs that were never designed for radio became global anthems. Teenagers, veterans, survivors, outsiders, people who had never seen themselves reflected in music suddenly heard their inner lives amplified. Chester had found his path. But beneath the breakthrough was a dangerous illusion forming, that turning pain into music might finally make the pain go away. And that belief, as powerful as it was, would later prove to be one of the most costly misunderstandings of his life. When Hybrid Theory was released in 2000, nothing about its success made sense on paper. The album wasn't polished pop. It wasn't safe rock. It was loud, anxious, angry, and emotionally exposed. And yet, within months, it was everywhere. By the end of its run, it had sold more than 27 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling debut albums in music history. Linkin Park went from anonymous to unavoidable. They sold out arenas across continents. Their songs dominated radio, MTV, and teenage bedrooms all at once. For a generation growing up with anxiety, isolation, and unspoken pain, this wasn't just music, it was recognition. Chester Bennington's voice didn't sound like a performer. It sounded like someone finally saying out loud what millions had been thinking in silence. On stage, Chester looked fearless. He screamed, jumped, laughed, commanded crowds of tens of thousands. From the outside, he appeared liberated, a man who had turned suffering into power. Fame, it seemed, had given his pain a purpose. But purpose is not the same as peace. The touring schedule was relentless. Night after night, Chester relived the same emotions on stage: rage, despair, self-hatred, because that was what the songs demanded. Fans felt healed by hearing them. Chester felt reopened by performing them. What sounded like catharsis to the audience was repetition to him. As the band released Meteora in 2003, success only intensified. The album debuted at #1 in multiple countries. Songs like Numb and Somewhere I Belong became generational anthems. Linkin Park was no longer just popular, they were culturally defining. Chester now had everything that was supposed to fix a broken life: money, recognition, a growing family, and a voice that mattered. And yet, the internal noise didn't fade. In fact, it grew louder. Behind the scenes, Chester struggled with sobriety. Addiction didn't disappear with success, it adapted. The pressure to perform, to be the emotional outlet for millions, became overwhelming. He was praised for being raw, but rarely asked how much that rawness cost him. Interviews began to reveal cracks. Chester spoke openly about depression, addiction, and self-hatred at a time when few artists did. He admitted that fame hadn't healed him. That some days, getting out of bed felt harder than stepping on stage. Fans admired his honesty, but honesty didn't equal relief. As Linkin Park experimented with new sounds on albums like Minutes to Midnight, Chester faced a growing identity conflict. The band wanted evolution. The industry wanted consistency. Fans wanted the pain they recognized. And Chester felt trapped between who he was becoming and who people needed him to remain. The irony was brutal. The more he helped others feel understood, the more isolated he felt himself. At home, he tried to be present, a husband, a father, a stable adult. But trauma doesn't disappear when the spotlight turns off. It waits. Sleepless nights became common. Anxiety followed him everywhere. The voice that roared on stage often fell silent in private. By the mid-2000s, Linkin Park had achieved a level of success most artists never reach. Awards, sold-out tours, global influence, the hallmarks of triumph were all there. But for Chester, the peak came with an unspoken realization: turning pain into art had not removed the pain, it had only given it a microphone. And as the years passed, that microphone never stopped demanding more. The stage became both a sanctuary and a prison. The applause both lifted him and reminded him of the distance between who he appeared to be and how he actually felt. Chester had climbed to the top, only to discover that the view didn't make the climb worth it. And slowly, beneath the glow of success, the cracks began to deepen. Success didn't calm Chester Bennington's mind. It sharpened it. As the years went on, the contrast between who he was on stage and who he was alone became unbearable. On stage, he was a symbol of survival, a man who screamed pain and walked away standing. Off stage, he was still negotiating with the same thoughts that had followed him since childhood. Fame hadn't removed them. It had given them a larger echo chamber. Chester often described depression not as sadness, but as exhaustion. The kind that sleep doesn't fix. The kind that makes existing feel like effort. Some days, he could command an arena. Other days, brushing his teeth felt impossible. The unpredictability terrified him. He never knew which version of himself he would wake up as. Relapse became part of that fear. After periods of sobriety, Chester found himself slipping back into alcohol and drugs, not out of recklessness, but out of desperation. Substances didn't make him feel good. They made him feel quiet. They slowed his thoughts enough to function. He later admitted that the most dangerous moments weren't the chaotic ones, but the calm ones, when his mind convinced him that numbing himself was logical, even necessary. The guilt was relentless. He felt guilty for relapsing. Guilty for hiding it. Guilty for talking openly about mental health while still struggling himself. Guilty for having a family who loved him and still feeling broken. Guilt stacked on top of trauma, creating a cycle that fed itself. The pressure to perform only intensified it. Linkin Park's music demanded emotional honesty every night. Chester didn't just sing about pain, he re-entered it. Each performance required him to access memories and emotions he had never fully processed. Fans left concerts feeling lighter. Chester often left feeling hollowed out. There was no off switch. As the band matured, expectations grew heavier. Every album carried scrutiny. Every change in sound sparked backlash. Some fans accused the band of losing their edge, while others demanded evolution. Chester absorbed it all. Criticism didn't bounce off him, it lodged inside. He was deeply sensitive, even when he tried to appear resilient. At home, the cracks were visible. Chester loved his children fiercely, but fatherhood came with its own fears. He worried about passing on his pain. He worried about being emotionally unavailable. He worried that no matter how hard he tried, something inside him would always be unstable. Sleep became fragmented. Anxiety followed him into every quiet moment. Silence, once a relief, became dangerous. His mind filled it with intrusive thoughts about failure, worthlessness, and inevitability. Therapy helped at times. Medication helped at times. But nothing offered permanence. Chester spoke openly in interviews about suicidal thoughts, describing them not as a desire to die, but as a desire for the noise to stop. He knew how dangerous those thoughts were. He warned others about them. He encouraged fans to seek help. And still, knowing the danger didn't make him immune to it. The contradiction was brutal. He became a spokesperson for mental health while privately fearing that he was losing ground. Fans looked to him as proof that survival was possible. Chester worried about what it would mean if he failed them. That pressure, to stay alive for others, quietly added another weight to an already collapsing structure. By the early 2010s, Chester's life was a balancing act with no safety net. Touring, recording, parenting, recovery, all while managing untreated layers of childhood trauma that had never fully surfaced. He wasn't ignoring the pain. He was outworking it. But pain doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits. And when something finally disturbed that balance, when loss entered the picture in a way he couldn't compartmentalize, the structure he had built around survival began to crack. The balance finally broke in May 2017. Chris Cornell, Chester Bennington's closest friend, confidant, and emotional mirror, was gone. Cornell wasn't just another musician to Chester. He was someone who understood the darkness without needing it explained. They talked about depression the way survivors talk to each other, carefully, honestly, without pretending it was simple. When Cornell died, Chester lost more than a friend. He lost proof that survival was possible. Chester sang at Chris Cornell's funeral. His voice didn't crack. His posture didn't collapse. To the outside world, he looked composed, strong, even. But inside, something irreversible had shifted. Later, Chester wrote that grief felt like a door closing behind you, with no handle on your side. It wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was an admission. The loss cut through every coping mechanism he had built. Grief reopened memories he had spent decades suppressing. Childhood trauma resurfaced with new force. Addiction cravings intensified. Sleep disappeared almost entirely. The quiet moments became unbearable. His mind, already exhausted, began looping on the same questions. How much longer can this continue? How many times can a person rebuild before there's nothing left? To the public, Chester still looked functional. Linkin Park was promoting One More Light, an album that leaned more openly into vulnerability than anything they had released before. Critics were divided. Some dismissed it as too soft, too emotional, too far from the band's roots. Chester internalized those reactions deeply. The album was personal, almost painfully so. Songs like Heavy weren't experiments. They were warnings. "I don't like my mind right now." That line wasn't metaphor. It was diagnosis. Friends later described Chester as oscillating between moments of clarity and moments of withdrawal. He wasn't constantly sad. That was the frightening part. Some days he laughed, planned, talked about the future. Other days, he retreated inward, distant but polite, as if already practicing absence. He didn't want to worry anyone. Chester had always been protective of others' feelings, even at the cost of his own. He had learned early that pain made people uncomfortable. So he edited himself. He softened the truth. He assured people he was okay, because it felt easier than explaining how complicated not okay really was. The pressure to keep going became overwhelming. He felt responsible for his bandmates, for his family, for his fans. He feared that admitting how close he was to the edge would become a burden others couldn't carry. And so he carried it alone, the same way he had learned to do as a child. On July 20, 2017, the fight ended. There were no dramatic gestures. No public breakdown. No message meant to explain or justify. Just a quiet room, a private moment, and a decision shaped by decades of unresolved pain rather than a single day of despair. Chester didn't die because he didn't love life. He died because the weight of surviving finally outweighed the strength required to continue. In the aftermath, confusion spread quickly. Fans searched lyrics for answers. Headlines tried to simplify what could not be simplified. Some asked how someone with so much could still feel so empty. Others looked for someone or something to blame. But the truth was quieter and harder to accept. Chester Bennington had been fighting since he was a child. He fought abuse. He fought addiction. He fought shame. He fought his own mind, publicly and privately, for most of his life. And like many long battles, it didn't end with a single dramatic moment. It ended with exhaustion. What followed wasn't just mourning. It was reckoning. People began talking more openly about mental health, not as a slogan, but as a reality that doesn't disappear with success. Fans shared stories of how Chester's music had kept them alive. And for the first time, many acknowledged the uncomfortable truth his life revealed: saving others does not guarantee saving yourself. The darkness Chester carried had never been invisible. It had been singing the whole time. Rebirth doesn't always mean recovery. Sometimes, it means what remains after the fight ends. In the months and years surrounding Chester Bennington's final chapter, there were real attempts at healing, not performative ones, not symbolic gestures, but human efforts made quietly, imperfectly, and without guarantees. Therapy. Sobriety. Conversations that went deeper than interviews. Music that moved away from rage and toward vulnerability. One More Light was not meant to be a farewell. It was meant to be a conversation. For the first time, Linkin Park openly explored grief, fragility, and emotional fatigue without hiding behind distortion or anger. Chester didn't scream as much. He admitted weight instead. Lines like, "Who cares if one more light goes out," weren't abstract philosophy, they were reflections of how invisible pain can feel, even when surrounded by people. The album confused many fans. Some wanted the old aggression. Some accused the band of losing its identity. What they missed was that Chester wasn't evolving musically, he was changing how he survived. Screaming had carried him for years. Now he was trying something else: honesty without armor. Privately, Chester was making efforts to stay present. He spoke openly about wanting to be a better father, about breaking cycles he feared passing on. He attended therapy consistently. He talked about mental health not as an abstract cause, but as a daily discipline, something that required maintenance, boundaries, and humility. There were moments when it worked. Friends described periods where Chester felt lighter, more grounded, more hopeful. He laughed easily. He planned ahead. He spoke about future projects. These moments mattered, not because they erased what came later, but because they proved something essential: he was trying. Rebirth, in Chester's life, wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was a series of small decisions to keep going. But rebirth is fragile when it rests on an exhausted foundation. The truth is uncomfortable but necessary. Not all wounds respond to effort alone. Trauma doesn't operate on fairness. You can do everything right and still struggle. Chester knew the tools. He advocated for them. He used them. And still, the weight returned. That doesn't invalidate the attempt. It defines its cost. After his death, the meaning of rebirth shifted, from individual survival to collective responsibility. Fans around the world began sharing stories of how Chester's music had kept them alive during their darkest moments. Not metaphorically. Literally. People spoke about nights they didn't end because a song made them feel understood. About days they stayed because someone else had named the pain they couldn't articulate. In that sense, Chester's life didn't end when his voice went silent. It changed form. Linkin Park didn't rush to replace him. They didn't turn grief into productivity. The band stepped back, honoring the weight of what had happened. When they did speak, it wasn't to explain Chester, it was to remind people that help exists, that conversation matters, that silence kills quietly. Mental health discussions shifted. What had once been whispered became speakable. Chester's openness, especially his contradictions, forced a more honest dialogue. Not "music saves lives" as a slogan, but a harder truth: music can help you survive, but it cannot replace care, connection, and sustained support. Rebirth, then, became communal. Chester's voice continued to do what it always had, carry pain, but now it carried a warning as well. That strength is not immunity. That love does not cancel trauma. That visibility does not equal safety. And still, meaning remained. Meaning in the fact that people sought help sooner. Meaning in conversations that no longer ended in shame. Meaning in recognizing that surviving is not a moral obligation, it is a complex, human struggle. Chester Bennington didn't leave behind a blueprint for healing. He left behind something more honest: evidence. Evidence that you can be loved and still hurt. That you can help others and still need help yourself. That trying matters, even when the outcome is imperfect. Rebirth, in the end, wasn't Chester becoming whole. It was the world becoming a little more aware of how fragile wholeness really is. After Chester Bennington's death, the silence felt heavier than the noise had ever been. There were no new screams. No interviews. No explanations that could make sense of what had happened. What remained was absence, and the realization that for many people, his voice had been woven into their survival in ways they were only beginning to understand. In the days that followed, fans didn't just mourn a musician. They mourned someone who had unknowingly stood beside them during their loneliest moments. Social media filled with stories that sounded eerily similar: "I didn't know him, but he understood me." Bedrooms, cars, headphones, the same places where his music once lived, became spaces of collective grief. Linkin Park chose not to rush forward. There was no immediate replacement, no attempt to move on as an act of professionalism. The band stepped back, publicly acknowledging that Chester was not a role to be filled, but a presence that had shaped everything they were. Their silence wasn't avoidance. It was respect. As time passed, something shifted. Mental health conversations surrounding Chester's life became more grounded, more honest. The narrative moved away from shock and speculation toward responsibility and awareness. People began to talk less about why he died, and more about how people suffer quietly, even when they appear strong. Chester's openness in interviews, once seen as vulnerability, began to be recognized as foresight. He had warned people. He had named the thoughts. He had described the exhaustion. In retrospect, his honesty wasn't a cry for attention, it was documentation. A record of what living with long-term trauma actually looks like, even under ideal circumstances. Organizations, fans, and artists alike began using his story not as tragedy porn, but as a reminder. Suicide prevention initiatives referenced his words. Musicians spoke more freely about their own struggles without fear of being dismissed as weak. Fans checked in on each other in ways they hadn't before. The legacy wasn't about glorifying pain. It was about reducing silence. Linkin Park's music took on a different weight. Songs once screamed in anger were now heard as survival documents. Lyrics fans had memorized for years revealed new meanings, not as clues, but as context. Chester hadn't been hiding his pain. He had been expressing it in the only language that felt safe. In time, the band returned to the stage in carefully chosen ways, not to recreate what was lost, but to honor what remained. Each decision was cautious, deliberate, human. Chester was never replaced. He was carried. For many fans, growing older meant understanding his music differently. What once felt like rebellion began to sound like fatigue. What once felt like rage now sounded like someone asking to be understood. That evolution didn't weaken his work, it deepened it. Chester Bennington's legacy isn't that music saves lives. That idea is too simple. His legacy is that pain can be shared without being solved, that honesty matters even when it doesn't heal everything, and that acknowledging struggle is not a failure of strength, it is an act of courage. He didn't leave behind answers. He left behind permission. Permission to speak. Permission to ask for help. Permission to admit that surviving can be harder than suffering. And in a world that still rewards silence over vulnerability, that may be the most lasting impact of all. Chester Bennington is often remembered for how loudly he screamed. But what matters more is why he screamed, and how many people heard themselves in that sound. His story isn't a warning about fame, or success, or even music. It's a reminder that pain doesn't disappear just because life looks full from the outside. That survival isn't a straight line. And that strength, no matter how visible, has limits. Chester didn't fail. He endured longer than most people ever realize. He lived with trauma that began before he had words for it. He carried it through adulthood, fatherhood, and a career that demanded emotional exposure night after night. He tried to heal. He tried to speak honestly. He tried to stay. And those attempts matter, even if the ending is difficult to accept. If there is meaning in his life, it isn't found in how it ended. It's found in how many people felt less alone because he spoke. This story isn't meant to be consumed and forgotten. It's meant to make one thing clear. If you see yourself in Chester's pain, you are not weak. If you feel exhausted by surviving, you are not broken. And if you need help, asking for it is not a betrayal of strength. Chester Bennington gave the world his voice. What we do with what it taught us, that part is still up to us.